Okay, so in this Baldur's Gate 3 video, I'm going to be talking a bit about how to make a build in Baldur's Gate 3. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the things that are going to contribute to your build in Baldur's Gate 3, how some of these things might differ from tabletop, and what sort of things you have to factor into making a build in this game. And I think there's a lot of people out there that are coming from pen and paper and tabletop that have builds they want to play in this game. I think the vast majority of those builds will work fine. But I think there is going to be some more nuance to those builds just because of some of the changes that are coming to this game or that we know from the full version. So I want to touch upon that as well. So for this video, I'm going to assume that you're going to make a custom character and that you're not going to use one of the origin characters, etc. because I don't really see the point in covering those when we would need to get into the details of things that affect custom characters. So once you've decided to create a custom character, you're going to select your race. That's the very first thing you're going to do, pick your race and your sub-race. And this is where things differ a bit from pen and paper. In 5th edition D&D and previously in Baldur's Gate 3 in early access, races had ability scores associated with them that made them a better fit for certain classes than others, and that has now been removed, giving you complete freedom to choose whichever race you want with whatever class you want, and those ability score points have been now associated with the class that you're going to choose. And really now the reason to choose a race over another race, besides, role-playing and dialogue options, which is a whole separate conversation, is because of their racial features. And some of these have changed as well from pen and paper and from earlier versions of Baldur's Gate 3, most notably human, dwarf, and half-elf. So you're going to want to pay attention to what these racial features are and see what fits best for your build. Some races, for instance, give you dark vision that makes it so that you can see in dark places. There are quite a few dark places in this game, and that's going to increase your hit chance in those scenarios. So that's really, really nice to have. So consider a good recommendation for a new player would be to select a race with dark vision. You don't have to do that, but that is a good tip for a new player. Dark vision is going to be very big in this game, I think. Another thing to factor in when looking at your race is its movement speed. Certain races move further than other races when they're in combat. Notably, smaller characters move a lot less. So, if you're playing a melee character, you might not want a character that has lower movement speed because it might not be able to reach the target it needs to attack in a given turn, therefore wasting some of its potential. So keep that in mind also when you're trying to decide what race to select. And really another important thing to take a look at is what proficiencies these races give you. Some races like Githyanki, Half-Elf, Human, Dwarf give you proficiencies that maybe you don't have from your class. For instance, if you're playing a spellcaster, but you really want to use a longsword, Githyanki might be great for your build because you're going to gain proficiency with that weapon type. So look at the proficiencies or the types of weapons and armor that you want to use on your character and see if you can gain some proficiencies from the race if you don't have them on your class. If you already have them on your class, it's less of a deciding factor, but if you want to pick up some proficiencies, race is a great way to do it. There are, of course, other things that factor into your racial decision in terms of racial features that I didn't mention, but those are three of the biggest ones. So that moves us along to class. You're obviously going to pick whatever class you want, whether that's a martial class, melee class, ranged class, caster class, support class, whatever. You're going to pick your class. And some of these classes have subclasses available to them during character creation, some don't. If you're trying to plan ahead to make your build, you'll probably want to know what these subclasses are, so you can look on the wiki to see what they are. You can look on our YouTube channel to see what they are. But you're going to want to know what these are in advance in order to plan your character properly. So once you've kind of figured out what your subclass is going to be, then you can worry about your ability scores, right? What do you want your strength to be? What do you want your dexterity to be? Your constitution, your charisma, etc. All these stats, what do you want them to be because of the subclass that you're going to choose? And I'm going to give you an example here using the Eldritch Knight of why it's important to know what subclass you're going to play in advance and how that can help, prepare for this. And it's also going to kind of dovetail into my next point about itemization as well. So Eldritch Knight is a subclass available to fighter, available at level 3. You can select it once you get to level 3 on your fighter. So if you made a fighter and then got there and selected Eldritch Knight, you can play as this. And what this does is it kind of gives your fighter some spellcasting capabilities. So if you want to be kind of like a hybrid character that casts spells and also has melee capabilities and can wear heavy armor and use weapons, then this is a subclass that you might choose. So then, assuming you're going to play Eldritch Knight throughout your playthrough during character creation, you can plan your abilities accordingly. Abilities are like attributes, right? So you can plan your abilities or attributes accordingly. And one thing about Eldritch Knight is that their spells use intelligence when they're cast. So if you are targeting enemies and you want to connect with your spells, you're more likely to connect with your spells if you have higher intelligence. But let's say, for instance, you're targeting yourself, or if you're targeting friendly units with buffs, then intelligence plays less of a role. Intelligence does not increase the number of spells you gain. So intelligence for an Eldritch Knight is useful if you plan to sling hostile spells at enemies, but is not super useful if you plan to buff yourself or allies. And those are just a few things to consider on your Eldritch Knight. For instance, do you want to be a strength-based Eldritch Knight, like more of a melee Eldritch Knight that melees in combat and then also uses spells to either buff yourself or attack enemies? Or do you want to be more of a dexterity-focused Eldritch Knight and use like finesse weapons and use like, predominantly ranged attacks and hang back and fling spells or buff your allies? So those are decisions you need to think with ahead of time as well. Whether you're going to be like more of a dexterity-focused ranged Eldritch Knight or maybe a melee-focused strength-based Eldritch Knight. And you will likely need some constitution as well, since fighters are usually tanky, and if you're particularly playing a melee character, you're going to take damage. And since constitution affects your HP, you're going to want a good amount of that if you're playing a melee character, and you'll want at least some of that if you're playing a ranged character as well, because even if you aren't on the front lines, you're probably going to be in the middle taking damage, hopefully before your wizard or sorcerer, because you're going to be a lot tankier than them in your heavy armor. So to simplify this a little bit, if you're playing a melee Eldritch Knight, you'd probably go Strength, Intelligence, Constitution as your main abilities. And if you're playing like a bow-based or a ranged-based Eldritch Knight, you would go Dexterity, Constitution, Intelligence, something like that. It's an oversimplification, but Eldritch Knight is a really good example of why it's important to plan your build ahead, because if you got to level 3 as a fighter and went, oh, I can play an Eldritch Knight and I can cast some spells, that sounds really cool, I want to do that. But if your ability spread had 0 points in intelligence because you didn't think this through, and playing a fighter, you don't typically think of high intelligence on a fighter. So if you didn't plan ahead for this, when you go to pick your Eldritch Knight and you have very low intelligence, you're kind of limited to picking spells that can buff yourself or your allies, because you're not going to connect very well with hostile spells because your intelligence is low, and it's going to reduce the likelihood you connect against enemies. And again, this is not a class guide for Eldritch Knight. This is just a very good example of the way builds work in this game, and this doesn't even factor everything in to Baldur's Gate 3. This is just D&D mostly stuff so far. This is just stuff that you can think with if you're a tabletop fan or a D&D player, but there are things that are very specific to Baldur's Gate 3 that further influence your decisions when making your build. And one of these things is the fact that you can respec. So maybe the first 3 levels of the game, you make your character like a fighter, with more points in strength, dexterity, and constitution focusing, or maybe just strength and constitution, or dexterity and constitution, not even worrying about intelligence. And then when you unlock Eldritch Knight at level 3, maybe you then go respec and reallocate your attribute points or your ability points to reflect that. So you can actually do that in this game. So maybe even though you didn't account for being an Eldritch Knight, now you can actually play effectively as a fighter for the first couple levels and then go switch into an Eldritch Knight. So there's things like that in this game as well. But respecing also has more impact on the way that you play stretches of the game than just this. And this comes in the way of feats. If you didn't know, you gain what's called a feat at level 4, 8, and 12. And these feats just give you basically passive benefits. Sometimes they give you ability scores, sometimes they give you spells, sometimes they give you proficiencies. It all depends on what feat you select. Well, let's say you want to take the Observant feat because this is something you want on your build. This gives you either +1 intelligence or +1 wisdom, and it gives you +5 bonus to your wisdom perception checks and your intelligence investigation checks. So whenever you test investigation or perception, you're going to have an extra 5 added to your roll, which makes you way more likely to succeed. This is really, really good if you're trying to be a very perceptive character. The thing is, though, by selecting this feat, you don't gain a lot of benefit to your intelligence modifier, because going from 16 to 17 doesn't increase your ability score modifier from +3 to +4. You'd have to get to 18. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to take this feat normally if you can't respec, because you'd kind of be giving yourself a disadvantage for a while. However, because you can respec in this game, you can play with optimized stats up to this point, and then respec your ability scores into like 15 intelligence, and then get that +1 to put you back up to +3. Or you could respec your ability score into 17, because that's the highest you can have during character creation, and then give yourself +1 and go up to 18 to get +4. So you can play optimized up until this point and then re-optimize. And that's something that I don't think people are really taking into consideration, because it's not possible in tabletop. And the last thing that's going to factor into your build is, of course, the equipment that you gain throughout the game, the itemization what you use to make your build stronger. And that's going to vary from build to build, right? And obviously, depending on the decisions that you make, the gear you get is going to be different. And if you're really trying to min-max your specific build, you would probably look on the wiki or on YouTube to see like what you can get from making certain decisions, because the loot in this game is fixed, which means that it's always going to be in the same place, give or take. If you kill guy A, you might miss out on loot A. And if you kill guy B, you might miss out on loot B, but you have to kill one, then which loot do you want? Those sort of things are going to happen in this game. And this is something, again, that's drastically different than tabletop, where you have no idea what loot you're going to get, so you can't really plan your build around loot. But because we have wikis and because we have the internet and YouTube, you can plan your build around this stuff. And again, one of the reasons that I selected Eldritch Knight is that there is an item in this game called the Warped Headband of Intellect that's been in early access. It's in the full release of the game, that's not very far into the game, that sets your intelligence score to 17. So this, when you equip this item, will set your intelligence score to 17, which will give you +3 modifier to intelligence for your checks and your saving throws and your attacks with intelligence on your spells. So this is really, really good for an Eldritch Knight. And what this allows you to do, by knowing the simple fact of knowing that this item is in the game, knowing where it is and that it's early, you can just dump intelligence and use this item if you want. Now, granted, it takes an item slot, so maybe there are better items for you later in the game that you might want to use. But by knowing that this is there, you could dump your intelligence early on in the game, go grab this item, slap it on, have 17 intelligence, which is really good on Eldritch Knight, focus your ability scores during character creation on strength and constitution, or dexterity and constitution, or some combination of those three, and not even worry about intelligence. And then later, if you find a better item, you can just respec and take that item and use it instead. So these are the sort of things that you really have to factor into your build, and builds in Baldur's Gate 3 are going to evolve over the course of the game. And part of the reason for that evolution is itemization and the gear that you find, and that keeps changing your build. Part of it is the fact that you're going to keep leveling and gaining class features and feats and stuff like that as you get higher and higher, and that's going to change the way your build plays. But another thing we haven't talked a bit about yet is multiclassing. So you can multiclass in Baldur's Gate 3, and when you level up, during your level up screen, you can select whatever other class you want. To my knowledge, the ability requirements to take a specific class has been removed. I have not actually seen this. I didn't look for it for whatever reason when I was doing my multiclassing with Larian, but that's what I've heard. That seems to be the information out there, and if that's true, that basically means you can just select whatever class you want. And here's where I expect the D&D fans and the D&D hardcore players to be really good, because they know the breakpoints, like how many classes or ranks of this class you should take versus how many ranks of this subclass you should take in order to make optimized builds. And I think if you're a D&D fan who's got a multi-class build in mind, or several multi-class builds, they should work fine in this game. The level discrepancy on them might change a little bit. For instance, like maybe if we're 10 levels in one class and 2 levels in another class, it might be like 9 and 3 now, depending on how closely Larian followed, but it's going to be pretty close, right? You should have a pretty good idea how it's going to work, and you can adjust accordingly, and if you mess it up for some reason, you can always respec. And I think respecing is going to play a huge role in multiclassing in this game, because, you know, let's say the level cap was 8. What would your build be then? Well, D&D tabletop players will be able to figure out, okay, if my level was 8, these are the, I take 6 classes of this and 2 classes of that. Well, that's probably the build they're going to use at level 8, and then they can respec later and take the build that would be good for them at level 9, or level 10, or level 12, and they can keep respecing into the optimal build for whatever level they are. And again, that's a huge departure from D&D, and it's going to have a lot of impact on the way you play your build throughout the course of the game. So all those things said, these are the things that keep me up at night when I think about a build for Baldur's Gate 3. That is a lot of information and complexity when it comes to your build in this game. And how do you put together a build that encompasses all of that? That tells you what to do at each level, that tells you what gear to get, even though maybe you can't get it because of decisions you made, that encompasses multi-classing and what the best multi-classing combinations are at each level? Or do you just simply make a build at a given level, like let's say 8 or something, and just say this is what you do at level 8 and let players kind of stumble their way to level 8 and then figure out what to do after that? I would actually love some feedback on that, because one of the things you're going to see at the launch of this game is, oh, best fighter build, best Eldritch Knight build, whatever, and it's going to be some level 12 build that you can play 10% of the game of, or something like that, right? Some build that doesn't come together until like the last bit of the game, and it doesn't tell you how to play up until that point. It just tells you how to play at level 12. So I want to make builds that help people through the game. So I'd love some feedback from you guys on what you think would be good information in a build enough to get you going. And do I need to do through level 6 and then do another build later from like 7 to 12 and continue it? Or should I wait till level 12 and do it? Or is there like an average somewhere? I'd love to hear from you guys. What do you guys make of all this? For those of you out there who are new players, is this overwhelming? Don't worry too much if it's overwhelming. We're going to have a lot more guides coming that explain a lot of basic concepts that will help you put together your own builds. But we will also have builds that you can follow. And I'm aiming to make builds that are actually followable and not just like some uber endgame build that doesn't really help you when you're level 4 and you're struggling in the game.